The Cellar. Welcome to another collection of stories. This particular collection will dive into stories of survival, where fate was ultimately averted. Just a quick reminder that these are all stories that have been covered on the channel prior. My reason for putting these particular videos together is that many prefer the longer form videos over the shorter ones. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you all enjoy. Todd Orr was a 50-year-old man from Bozeman, Montana. Bozeman is a city located in southern Montana in the Rocky Mountains. It was October 1st, 2016, and Todd woke up early at 4 a.m. Todd was heading on a trip into the wilderness on this day, one he had made numerous times over the course of his lifetime spent in the outdoors. For him, this day was like any other. He woke up, got dressed, grabbed something quick for breakfast, and hopped into his pickup truck with his handgun tucked safely in his chest holster. In the pickup truck, Todd already had his backpack loaded with all the gear he would need for the trip. He started the engine and set off on an hour-long trip. He would soon arrive at the trailhead with about an hour left until daylight. He would double-check his gear and head off onto the trail before him. This particular trip for Todd was a scouting expedition for elk. The area where Todd was hiking today was Bear Creek, which is located in the Madison Range, a section of the Rockies that runs between West Yellowstone and Bozeman. The trail ahead of Todd was pure, untouched, and thick forest. This particular trip Todd was making would help determine whether the area would be a good one for him to hunt in the upcoming weeks. Todd was an avid outdoorsman with decades of experience. In 1990, he completed a degree in fish and wildlife management at Montana State University, and to put it as simply as possible, Todd knew what he was doing whenever he trekked into the wilderness. One could say he felt most alive and at home when he was out there enjoying the peace and tranquility of nature. Todd made his trek on the path ahead. As he made it around an hour into his hike, daylight was beginning to illuminate the landscape before him. That's when he encountered a large, female grizzly bear walking with her two cubs. They were making their way down the trail and heading in the direction that Todd was coming from. In that moment, Todd froze and made eye contact with the bear, and in an instant the mama bear and her cubs were heading off into the woods away from Todd. He waited a couple of minutes to give her and her cubs plenty of time to exit the area, and he continued walking in the opposite direction that she had ran off in. He had only continued on for about a minute prior before hearing a rustle of branches and a snapping of twigs. In an instant, he saw that the bear had left her cubs and was now barreling straight at him. This over 400-pound animal was moving straight at him, and he only had mere seconds to react. He reached for the bear spray that he kept on him and proceeded to blast the spray straight at the animal just before it plowed into him. He turned his body at the last moment and dropped to the ground to protect himself as the animal made contact with him at full speed and mass. The bear stood on top of him and proceeded to bite his right arm and shoulder around 6 or so times. Just as quickly as that all occurred, the bear began to cough from the spray that Todd had hit the animal with, and the bear disappeared back into the wilderness. At this point, Todd had numerous puncture wounds to his arm and shoulder and was bleeding quite profusely. But in looking himself over, he realized he had not sustained any life-threatening injuries. He quickly began backtracking in the direction of his truck. He had made about 5 minutes of progress before he once again heard the distinct snapping of twigs and branches. The bear was back and was not happy whatsoever. The animal slammed into Todd from behind and bit down on his left forearm, breaking the bone. The bear continued clawing and now shaking Todd around in a fury. Todd knew all he could do in this moment was try and keep still and not react to the unbelievable pain the bear was inflicting upon him. The animal would bite him around 30 times and slammed and shook him around continuously. If you've ever seen the movie The Revenant, where Leonardo DiCaprio is attacked by the bear, just imagine that scene taking place. The bear continued inflicting pain on Todd, and when it would do so, it would stop and wait for any kind of sign that he was still alive. In what felt like an eternity, the bear bit Todd once more, and time seemed to freeze. The quiet was deafening in its own right, as Todd laid there hoping for the attack to be over with. When he finally got the guts to roll over and look around, he realized he was now, finally, alone in the woods again. He did what he could to collect himself and his things, including his handgun, which had been thrown away from him in the attack, and he proceeded to attempt the hour-long hike out of the woods. Miraculously, at 8 a.m., Todd would finally locate the safety of his vehicle, but he now had a 45-minute trip ahead of him to the hospital. He did what he could to tend to his wounds before setting off. At the hospital, it would take numerous doctors to stitch up his seemingly unending wounds. Even more amazing is that 8 hours later, he would end up walking out of the hospital and driving himself home. Although he did have to come back the next day for surgery to fix the broken bone, the severed tendons, muscles, and nerves. The surgeries would end up going successfully, and 6 weeks after the attack, Todd and a friend of his would make their way back to the scene of the crime. As bad as the attack was and how close he came to dying on that fateful day, his love of the wilderness was something he never wanted to give up on. It's reported that Todd still hunts in that area, but he does so in the daylight and prefers to go when there is snow on the ground. That way he can see the paw prints before he chances another encounter with one of nature's most fierce apex predators. I want to give a ton of credit to Chris Bennett, who wrote an amazing article about this particular story. His breakdown of the entire thing was extremely in-depth and helped me outline and tell the story myself. If you're interested in reading his extremely well-written article on the story, I will link it in the description box below. Matthew Allen was an 18-year-old boy from Sydney, Australia. It's reported that Matthew suffers from some sort of mental illness, which is believed to have played a large hand in the events that occurred back on November 27, 2012. On this day, Matthew left his home with little more than the clothes on his back and a small amount of food. He would leave his cell phone in his bedroom and head out into the Australian bush on a survival mission of sorts. Now, what actually transpired while Matthew was out in the wilderness is not completely known, but Matthew's mother would immediately contact police after he was found missing, and a search would be underway. The police launched numerous helicopters and rescue dogs into the surrounding bushland, but after weeks of extensive searches, no evidence of Matthew was found. The more time went by, the more it seemed apparent that Matthew had most likely succumbed to the harsh and unforgiving bushland. To add to it all, it is believed that searchers may have gotten close to finding Matthew a handful of times, but Matthew was actively avoiding people and wanted to be left alone. During the time frame he was missing, Australia would go through a record-breaking heat wave that led to numerous wildfires throughout the country. After 2 months had passed, it seemed hopeless that Matthew would be found alive, but his family never gave up hope that they would be able to bring their child home. That brings us to Saturday, January 26, 2013. 2 hikers were making their way through the bushland not far from where Matthew had gone missing. As they made their way through the harsh terrain, they would make an unbelievable discovery. They spotted a disoriented man lying on the ground. This man was none other than Matthew Allen. After 9 weeks out there alone, Matthew was found emaciated and covered from head to toe in leeches. Mosquito bites marked the skin all over his body, and his feet and lower legs were suffering from a terrible case of gangrene. Rescue workers were contacted and would use a helicopter to winch the man out of the woods and straight to a nearby hospital. When he arrived, it was determined that he was badly dehydrated and had lost around 50% of his prior weight. He was also suffering from partial blindness. It's ultimately believed that if Matthew had been left out there for even a day or 2 more, he most likely would have succumbed to a horrible fate. Not a lot is known about how Matthew managed to survive for as long as he did, but police believe he had been exposed to the elements the entire time he was missing. Matthew had no shelter of any kind, and he survived purely on the small amount of food he had brought with him and water he had located from an almost completely dried out creek bed. At the end of the day, with little to no survival training, Matthew's story of survival is one of extraordinary luck and determination. Matthew would end up making a full recovery, and his family vowed to make sure he got the mental help he needed moving forward. Lindy Harding was a 21-year-old student at Hull University at the time of the story I am telling here today. Hull University is located in Kingston upon Hull, a city in the East Riding of Yorkshire, England. Lindy had a passion for chemistry and would later graduate and become a teacher. In 1999, Lindy's mother would pass away in her sleep from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, otherwise known as sudden death syndrome. Lindy and her family were absolutely shattered by the sudden death. In the aftermath of her mother's death, Lindy was looking for a distraction from the pain and heartache. This is when she would seek out the Hull University Parachute Club. From the very beginning, she knew skydiving was the exhilarating thing she needed in her life. She made her first jump from 3,500 feet over the Humber Bridge in Hull. She was quoted as saying, "I was so excited. I'd never been in a plane before, let alone jumped from one. I loved it as much as I thought I would." This newfound passion would result in Lindy looking to make jumps as often as she could. She would complete a total of 10 jumps over the next couple of years, but this number would have been much greater if it wasn't for bad weather often canceling her attempts. This led to the club organizing a trip for 7 to California in April of 2001. The trip to California could not have started off any better. The weather was beautiful, the sun was constantly shining, and Lindy completed 4 jumps. The trip was everything she had hoped for upon making the journey across the globe. This leads us to Lindy's 5th jump of the trip. Just like all her jumps prior, Lindy checked her parachute and prepared to board the plane. As they took to the sky, Lindy sat eagerly waiting. The plane would make its way to the designated altitude, and those on board prepared themselves for the trip back down to Earth. It was now Lindy's turn to go, and the okay was given. Lindy jumped out of the plane like she had 14 times prior. The adrenaline of soaring through the air at upwards of 70 miles per hour is like nothing else. As Lindy completed her descent, she would pull the cord on her parachute. Nothing happened. She then deployed her reserve parachute. But to her absolute horror, the main chute would deploy with the reserve, and they both would get tangled up in one another, making both redundant. Lindy would continue hurtling towards the ground for another 40 seconds, moving at upwards of 70 miles per hour. The parachutes would slow her descent slightly, but not enough to stop her from plummeting straight into the earth below. Lindy had plummeted a mile through the air to the ground below. What she went through should have been enough to end her life. But miraculously, Lindy would wake up 8 days later in a hospital bed with her father and sister sitting by her side. She had absolutely no recollection of what had happened, where she was, or how she had gotten there. The most amazing aspect of this story is that Lindy had only suffered 2 fractured ribs, a punctured lung, a broken nose, and a chipped tooth. Doctors ultimately believed that she had passed out prior to hitting the ground, and the relaxed state her body was in may have been the difference between life and death. 3 weeks later, Lindy would make the trip back home to the UK, and 7 days after arriving home, she would go back to school. She was determined to get on with her life and live it to the fullest. Although she only displayed minor injuries, the road to recovery was not an easy one by any stretch of the imagination. She suffered short-term memory loss for a long time and was in a constant state of pain. But she continued to push forward, and in 2002 she would graduate. In November of 2004, she would meet her future husband Paul, and prior to getting married a few years later, she would tackle her fears and go skydiving once more. Lindy believed that before she got married, she needed to make another jump or she would regret it for the rest of her life. So she boarded a plane and successfully made a tandem jump just a couple months prior to her wedding. Lindy would say that after completing this jump, she felt like she could finally put the accident behind her and start her new and true beginning of life. At the time of the events that transpire in this story, Kennedy Littledyke was only 16 years old. Kennedy lives in Burley, Idaho. Burley is a city in Cassia and Minidoka counties in southern Idaho. There she attended school at Declo High School. Declo High is the second largest high school operated within Cassia County. Kennedy was a good student and a strong soccer player. In fact, she was the captain of the Declo High soccer team. With so much life left ahead of her, little did she know that a night in May of 2021 would change the course of her existence forever. It was May 22nd, 2021. Kennedy and two of her friends were hanging out, and the group made the decision to go on a short 4-mile drive to what they call the Declo D. The Declo D is a mountain range in Declo, Idaho that has the letter D marked into it. This particular area was known as a good spot to watch the sunset, and Kennedy and her friends were heading there to do just that. After making the drive there, the group of friends talked, and in particular, Kennedy vented her frustrations to her friends about the recent breakup of her and her boyfriend. Kennedy and her boyfriend had just recently broken up, and she was feeling extremely emotional about the entire thing. She was even quoted later on as saying that she was in a very dark and depressed state at this point in her life. She was feeling so low that thoughts of suicide were consistently on her mind. After watching the sunset, the group hopped back into Kennedy's vehicle and were in the process of making the short drive back to her house. They made it to the bottom of the mountain and were about 1 mile from their destination when the car veered ever slightly and Kennedy overcorrected. Upon overcorrecting, the car would slam straight into a telephone pole, and the car would begin flipping over and over. None of the passengers in the vehicle were wearing seatbelts at the time, and subsequently all 3 of them were launched from the vehicle at different points. Kennedy's 2 friends were both seriously injured in the accident, but Kennedy was the one who was now in a very unbelievable situation. The accident had launched Kennedy around 30 feet into the air. As she was launched, her body would connect with the electrical wires above, and her already badly broken and damaged leg would become entangled within the wire. Kennedy herself was in and out of consciousness during the entire ordeal, but when she realized the predicament she was in, she knew she didn't have much time. A man that lived nearby was the first to arrive on scene, and he immediately called 911 in order to get help there as quickly as possible. It is reported that for most of the ordeal, Kennedy was calm, cool, and collected, at times talking to people below her and consistently asking that somebody help get her down. Emergency workers would arrive on scene, and the situation before them was one they had never witnessed before. The electrical company had to be called to shut off power in order for rescue workers to even attempt to get Kennedy down. Luckily for Kennedy, a lot of miracles went her way on this particular night. Using some form of a ladder and bucket, the crews were able to finally reach Kennedy. Once they did, they were able to get a tourniquet on her leg, and they proceeded to get her down and into an ambulance. It is reported that there were numerous instances where they thought they may lose the young 16-year-old. She would be rushed to a nearby hospital where numerous surgeries would have to be performed. In an effort to save as much of her leg as possible, 4 amputations were done. The final amputation being where the femur break had occurred and where the tourniquet had been placed on her leg. It wasn't until this final amputation was done that Kennedy would start to show signs of recovery. After everything that transpired, it was an absolute miracle that all 3 passengers of the vehicle had survived. One of Kennedy's friends had a broken neck, back, and pelvis. Kennedy herself had her arm almost completely ripped off. The arm was hanging on by no more than the skin from her back. The arm itself has 5 main nerves that run through it, and Kennedy had 3 of them ripped completely from the spinal root, while the other 2 were stretched badly. Her collarbone and humerus were snapped, and as we already talked about, her femur in her leg was badly broken, which resulted in the subsequent amputation. Miraculously, the doctors were able to save her arm, and after doing a nerve transfer, they believe she may regain up to 50% of her control and mobility within that arm. Kennedy herself, though, has stated that she is 100% determined to get 100% of her mobility back. As terrible as all of this sounds, what makes Kennedy's story all the more uplifting is that she has been very clear that this accident may have saved her life. She was in a dark place prior to the accident, and after surviving it, she has found a new lease and purpose to her life. She still bears the guilt of what her friends went through, but at the end of the day, her accident wasn't an instance of speeding or drinking and driving. It was simply an accident by the very definition, and in the aftermath of it all, Kennedy has made it a point to share her story and her recovery. She has received an outpouring of support on social media as she continues to work hard and relearn how to walk with her prosthetic leg. At the end of the day, Kennedy continues to push forward while inspiring others through her pure determination and grit, carrying with her a whole new appreciation for the beauty in every sunrise that she almost didn't get to live to see. It was July 13, 1978, at the Institute for High Energy Physics in Protvino, near Superkov, Russia. A scientist by the name of Anatoly Bogarsky was busy working when a problem developed within the Institute's particle accelerator. In order to determine what the problem was, Anatoly decided he would have to stick his head into the channel where the proton beam runs throughout. Unbeknownst to Anatoly at the time, a prior experiment had been performed and the proton beam was still running. During that experiment, the warning lights were shut off and never turned back on, and this information was never passed down to Anatoly. As Anatoly proceeded to place his head inside the channel, his head would cross in front of the invisible beam of proton. His head and brain were immediately zapped, but in that moment, Anatoly felt zero pain. He would later describe that he saw a flash of light that was brighter than 1,000 suns. After he removed his head, he immediately knew he was in for some dire consequences. But he decided not to tell anyone, and he subsequently completed his work for the day and awaited the symptoms he knew were soon to come. As he tried to sleep that night, his face would begin to swell, and the longer the night drew on, the more uncomfortable he was. After completing a mostly sleepless night, Anatoly decided it was time to go tell the doctors what had happened. He would be immediately rushed to a special radiation clinic that was located in Moscow, Russia. Now, to put everything in this story into perspective, a dose of radiation from about 400 to 1,000 rads is typically more than enough to kill a person. It is believed that the dose of radiation that Anatoly took in that brief moment was in the range of 200,000 to 300,000 rads. But this situation was very unique, as no human had ever been exposed to this much radiation in such a focused beam before. The proton beam itself had entered through the back of his head, straight through his brain, and exited straight out the front of his nose. It literally burned a hole straight through the middle of his brain, which resulted in the left side of his face being left paralyzed. Doctors at the radiation clinic watched and examined Anatoly day to day, waiting for and expecting the absolute worst. But miraculously, the swelling would start to subside, and Anatoly would recover from the incident. Ultimately, his face would remain paralyzed on the one side. He also lost hearing in his left ear, and he developed seizures over time, but his intelligence remained completely intact. 18 months after the incident, Anatoly would return to work. He would go on to complete his PhD, and he would end up holding the post of Coordinator of Physics Experiments at the U-70 Proton Synchrotron, which is where the incident had originally occurred. Even after everything that has transpired, Anatoly would go on to lead a long life, and according to my research, he turned 81 years old this past June. Now, for this particular story, there have been different reports given over the years. So as far as how much of this story is 100% factual, it's hard to completely know, but I'll do my best to tell this tale of survival and determination. Ricky McGee was born in either 1970 or 1971 in Gippsland, Victoria, Australia. Gippsland is a rural region that makes up the southeastern part of Victoria. He would move around a handful of times throughout his life, working a large variety of jobs over the years. That brings us to 2006. Ricky was living in Queensland, but had been recently offered a job in Port Hedland, Western Australia. After he decided to take the job, he set off on the very long drive in his 2001 Mitsubishi Challenger. Now this is the part where details become a bit unclear. Ricky himself first reported that his car had broken down on this trip, but later on when the Washington Post reached out to him about his story, it changed drastically. He would later tell a tale where he was drugged by some hitchhikers that he had stopped to help and was left for dead in a shallow grave. No matter what the truth is, Ricky was left in a rough situation. He would travel for 10 days across the northeastern fringe of the Tanami Desert, losing consciousness sporadically due to heat exhaustion. He ate leeches, insects, ants, lizards, snakes, and anything else that was edible that he could get his hands on. He would consistently scavenge for water in various dams and water holes, stating that he often only ate one meal a day, and it was just enough food and water to keep himself alive. For about 10 weeks, Ricky lived within a hole. During the daytime, he would consistently be cooking, and in the evening, he would basically freeze. Because the outback can be one of the most unforgiving terrains on all of planet Earth. After 71 days of barely surviving, Ricky would end up being rescued by nearby station hands, who just happened to be surveying the area. By the time he was found, he had dropped from 230 pounds down to a measly 99 pounds. His survival was a pure miracle. Over the years, his story and tale of survival have been questioned by many, but Ricky has stayed true to what he went through and even wrote a book titled Left for Dead: How I Survived 71 Days in the Outback. Whether one completely believes his tale of survival or not, a person's ability to survive typically boils down to three things: water, food, and shelter, along with a mindset of doing whatever it will take to survive another day. For survival depends on what you do, not what you think, and there's never any harm in hoping for the best as long as you've prepared yourself for the absolute worst. On October 24th, 1901, Annie Taylor became the first person to successfully attempt to go over Niagara Falls in nothing more than a barrel. Following her successful trip over the falls, she was quoted as saying, "Nobody ought to ever do that again." For the following 10 years, Annie's words of wisdom would ring true. That was until July 25th, 1911, when a daredevil from England would proceed to make the second ever attempt at the daunting falls. Bobby Leach was born in Lancaster, England in 1858. I could not find a lot of information about Bobby's early life, but Bobby was not new to the Niagara Falls area. In fact, in 1906, he successfully parachuted off the Upper Steel Arch Bridge into the Niagara River. Following this parachuting endeavor, Bobby became determined to not only be the second person to go over Niagara Falls, but to be the first man to ever do it. So what makes the falls so dangerous? The crest line of the Canadian Horseshoe Falls measures approximately 670 meters wide, or 2,200 feet. It has a vertical plunge of 57 meters, or 188 feet, to the river below. To put that into some perspective, 188 feet is equivalent to roughly a 17-story building. So in order to successfully go over the falls, a person has to survive a 17-story drop in little more than a barrel. Even if you survive the fall itself, you have to then survive any injuries you may obtain and hope those injuries don't result in you drowning after the fact. There isn't anything about this stunt that one could deem safe. That brings us back to Tuesday, July 25th, 1911. After years of wanting to become the first man to survive a trip over the falls, Bobby Leach was ready to go. Bobby would proceed to get inside a cylindrical steel barrel with wooden bumpers at each end. He then strapped himself into a tight harness. At 2:55 p.m., Bobby Leach was cut loose at the mouth of Chippewa Creek. There was no going back. The first piece of adversity for Bobby would come at around 3 p.m. His barrel was opposite the Toronto powerhouse. There, it struck a large rock which would tear off the front bumper on his barrel. The impact was so severe that Bobby would suffer a large gash on his forehead. Following this incident, the barrel would continue its trajectory towards the Horseshoe Falls. Roughly 13 minutes later, at 3:13 p.m., Bobby Leach, strapped inside his mostly intact barrel, would be seen going over the infamous Niagara Falls. It would take a bit of time before anyone knew whether or not Bobby Leach had survived. After going over the falls, Bobby's barrel would be seen near the Ontario Power Plant. It would end up caught in an eddy. For the next 20 minutes or so, Bobby and his barrel swirled around and around, until finally, a man who worked for the power company by the name of Fred Bender would take action. Fred handed one end of a rope to a group of his fellow employees while tying the other end around his waist. He would proceed to jump into the water. He then swam out to the barrel and grabbed a hold while his fellow coworkers pulled them both back to the shore. After making it back ashore, a hammer was used on the barrel to see if any reaction would be given back from Bobby Leach. Within a silent moment that stretched for what felt like an eternity, Bobby would hammer back on the barrel, and all those that had crowded around would erupt into cheers. Bobby Leach had become the second person and the first man to survive a trip over the falls. Ultimately, Bobby suffered a gash on his forehead and was badly bruised all over. Some accounts even say that his kneecaps were both broken. But after receiving some oxygen, Bobby seemed to recover quite a bit. Following this feat, Bobby, his barrel, and his wife would tour numerous parts of the world, living up the fame that came with such a daredevil experience. Bobby would then go on to enjoy another 15 years of life before an ironic fate would claim the man's life. While walking down a street in Auckland, New Zealand, Bobby would slip on an orange peel. He fell down and broke his leg. The break would end up becoming infected and it had to be amputated. Bobby Leach would end up dying while in surgery. He was subsequently buried in Auckland's Hillsborough Cemetery. An anticlimactic fate for a man that lived a life full of climactic moments. Jose Salvador Alvarenga was born in 1975 in Ahuachapan, El Salvador. Ahuachapan is a city and municipality with a population of around 110,000 people that is located in western El Salvador. Growing up, Jose's father owned a flour mill and store in their town. Jose had numerous brothers and absolutely loved everything to do with fishing. In 2002, that love would see Jose leave El Salvador and head to Mexico, where he would take up work as a fisherman. He loved being out on the water, and with little formal education, there wasn't a lot of other employment options available to Jose. That now brings us to November 17, 2012, a day that began like any other day. At the time, Jose was a shark fisherman out of Costa Azul, Mexico. Jose operated out of a small but nimble fiberglass fishing boat. Typically, he would go out and fish in the extremely risky deep-sea waters located around 50 to 100 miles offshore. At the time, Jose was planning to take a 2-day fishing trip with a much younger fisherman by the name of Cordoba. Cordoba was reported as being a 22-year-old who was extremely inexperienced in comparison to Jose, who was 35 at the time and had years of experience dating all the way back to when he was a child. The pair would set out for the deep waters off the coast, hoping for a couple of good days of fishing. Around the same time they set off, a storm was slowly approaching in the distance. Jose had experienced numerous storms while out at sea, and at the time it wasn't something that worried him whatsoever. But only a handful of hours into their trip, the storm would hit, and it hit them hard. The pair hunkered down in the small vessel as the storm would begin its onslaught, lasting for around 5 to 7 days. By the time the sunshine returned, the pair were badly blown off course. To add to their extremely bad luck, the electronics on the boat were all but ruined by the weather, leaving them unable to call someone on the radio for help. Everything that could go wrong on this trip seemingly did, as Jose attempted to start up the ship's motor, only to find that it too had been damaged. With nothing else they could do, the pair of men continued to do all they could to ration what little supplies they did bring with them. They had only planned to be out on the water around 36 hours, and at this point, it had been 7 days. Back on shore, Jose's boss made the decision to send a search party out to try and locate Jose and his vessel. But after 2 days of searching, the efforts were abandoned. It was presumed at the time that Jose and Cordoba had simply drowned during the prior day's storms. Days would soon turn to weeks, and weeks would soon turn to months. Jose and Cordoba continued to survive out on the open sea, eating raw fish, turtles, jellyfish, and anything else they could get their hands on. They made efforts to capture any rainwater that they could and continued to push on day after day. The boat that the pair were now calling home had no cover, just an icebox, which is a large trunk used by the fishermen to store their catch until they get it back to shore. The pair had also lost all their fishing gear during the storm. For most, this would have been a death sentence, but Jose had been fishing since he was a child. As a kid in El Salvador, Jose had learned how to catch a fish with no hooks or lines by simply sticking his bare hands into the water. This skill would keep the pair alive for numerous months. During those months, both men would lose a considerable amount of weight, becoming more and more disheveled in appearance with each passing day. It was a rainy day when tragedy would strike once again. The pair of men were huddled up inside the icebox, praying together like they had so many days before. It was during a quiet moment when Cordoba turned to Jose and asked him to visit his mother for him and let her know he was now with God. The pair of men looked at each other and then said goodbye. According to Jose, Cordoba wasn't in pain. He was seemingly calm and at peace, passing away without any suffering. This sad moment would now leave Jose alone out on the open ocean with dwindling hope of ever being rescued. After 6 days, Jose had a realization that he was consistently speaking with a corpse, and it was at this point he knew, for his own sanity, that he had to take Cordoba's body and drop it into the water, and that's exactly what he did. But following this action, Jose would fall into a deep depression. He even contemplated taking his own life in the days after dropping his friend's body into the ocean. But ultimately, Jose's faith in God would keep him pushing forward. Jose would continue using his hands to catch whatever he could eat. His little boat would become a spot within the ocean that seabirds would frequently stop at for a rest. Jose would quietly wait until the moment was right to snatch a bird to eat. At times when water was scarce, he would drink the blood of any bird or turtle he was able to get his hands on. Jose's faith and ability to catch food with his bare hands would continue to keep him alive. It's believed that Cordoba had passed away around 5 to 6 months after the storm had hit. Jose would continue to fight for his survival for a further 9 months following the loss of his friend. During this time, Jose kept believing that a boat would eventually find them. But a boat would not be his salvation. Jose's salvation would be land. After 438 days lost at sea, Jose would see land for the very first time. First, Jose worried he was hallucinating, but as more time passed by, the boat would continue to get closer to the landmass. Once Jose was certain what he was seeing was real, he dove into the water and began swimming towards solid ground. Jose would soon make it to the shore, where he immediately collapsed onto the sand. He was so happy and relieved to be out of the ocean at last. It was now January 29th, 2014. Jose had last been on solid ground November 17th of 2012. The island that Jose had made it to was one in the string of Marshall Islands. To put this into context, Jose was 6,022 miles, or 9,692 kilometers, away from where he had originally cast off on his journey in Mexico. Jose would soon rise up on the beach and locate some local residents. He would be transported to the biggest hospital on the Marshall Islands, where doctors and nurses would begin to care for the extremely dehydrated man. Following his rescue, Jose would begin speaking about his story, but it wouldn't be long before skeptics started to question whether or not he was telling the truth. But Jose simply didn't care about what anyone had to say about his unbelievable story of survival. Following everything that had occurred, the University of Hawaii and other independent oceanographers would later state that Jose's story of survival was entirely possible, with weather models showing that ocean drift did in fact match Jose's 6,000-mile journey. Jose would also work with a journalist named Jonathan Franklin. The pair would work together to publish the book called 438 Days. This book dives into Jose's entire story of survival, and if you'd like to know more about his story and really dive into it further, then I recommend you pick up a copy today. Following his release from the hospital, Jose would come through on his friend Cordoba's final wishes, as he would travel to Mexico and deliver Cordoba's final words to his mother. Today, Jose lives back in El Salvador, making efforts to live a better life following his courageous journey. He is currently working to make amends with his daughter, whom he had abandoned so many years prior. He also quit drinking and no longer fishes or even goes out on the water. It's easy to say that Jose's harrowing journey changed him, but if you ask Jose, it changed him for the better, as he is now a much more grateful man who is simply happy to be alive. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. Also, you can check the description box below and find the link to my merch store. Tons of awesome designs, and the proceeds help fund the channel. For those of you that are interested, I have a Cellar Dwellers membership tier for the channel. It's $2.99 a month and comes with some pretty cool perks, so if that interests you, then please go ahead and check it out. I also have that linked in the description box below. If you would like to submit a real-life scary story that you would like featured on an episode on the channel, please do so using the email linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to support the channel is greatly appreciated. Until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.